The Zora Neale Hurston Trust presents the It's All About Zora series. We'll be discussing all things Zora with artists, academics, and fans of Zora Neale Hurston on the It's All About Zora series. Plus, we will uncover her influences on our guests' lives and work. So let's get the conversation started. Good afternoon. I am Rae Chesny, Zora Neale Hurston Scholar, and today I'm joined by the incomparable and incredible Dr. Elizabeth Alexander. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I am so happy to be with you and always happy to be under the umbrella of Zora's name.
We're going to be talking all things Zora, but in the Trayvon Generation, there was one passage of the many that stood out. And if it's okay with you, I'll read it because I have a follow-up question for you. It's this one right here. Hurston profoundly understood the expendability of Black life. She had a historian sense of the need to preserve. She knew memorials mattered, and she knew it was up to Black people to make the memorials and tell the stories themselves. That passage has stuck with me since I first read this book. And I have to ask you, do you envision yourself as doing that in the same tradition as Zora?
First, I'd love to say more about the quotation, and I'm so happy that you read it because it comes from a letter that Zora Neale Hurston wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois. And she was, as you know, an amazing letter writer, philosophical, funny. I mean, her letters are of the quality that many of her books are. And she was proposing to Du Bois that he help to establish something. She had an idea called the Cemetery for the Illustrious Negro Dead. And she had a very clear vision. It should be in a certain place of Florida with certain plans. We should commission Black sculptors and artists to make work to go in this space. Because, she said, then we will never be forgotten. My own work as a poet in a tradition of Black poets who are always capturing history, making memory, defining history as being not only at the global level, but also at the local level, the communal level, the family level. That too is history. And when we've been left out or misnamed of some spaces that call themselves history, I think that it is our artists who have said, we're not going to let this go. So yes, that absolutely animates my poetry. If you think about something, for example, like that Hurston letter, and she talks about inconspicuous forgetfulness. And we have that example of her life that, you know, one of the greatest geniuses this country has ever known could, at the end of her life, be in inconspicuous forgetfulness until Alice Walker marked her space. I think that's what we do as Black writers and scholars, trying to capture and find and shed light and contextualize the scraps and beauties and powers and wisdoms of our lives that could otherwise be forgotten, though never lost. Never lost.
I love that note at the end, is never lost. When you talk about the preservation, as long as it's preserved, it's always there for us to find. You use one of my favorite words, genius, because I think that when it comes to the under-recognized, I will say, Zora in an essay, Art and Such, she says something like all the unimagined geniuses who must have lived and died. And I think one of the things that we take for granted is the cost of genius. Anybody would be hard-pressed to not identify you as a genius. And so when we think about genius, what did it cost you to write something like the essay and then to expand it into a full book?
Thank you for characterizing me so. Thank you. And, you know, to the cost, what a very interesting question. This is the first book that I wrote in my role as president of the Mellon Foundation. So with a very, very, very demanding institutional day job, night job. all-encompassing job. We work very hard, of course, as professors, but there is a different ability to control our time. If you want to have impact in philanthropy, I think you have to charge full speed ahead with full focus. And I think that I have had to take my creativity and put it to this work. I think what was hard, I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of cost, was when my train of thought is on this big work, how can I make space and time to hold a train of thought for my writing? This is the sort of straight up hardest job I've ever done in my life. So only being able to hold on to a paragraph, inch by inch, and holding the train of thought cost me a lot of sleep and kind of physical effort, and a little bit of woe that I wasn't able to go to my writer place. It has to get quiet for you to be able to work. So maybe that means like the kids are in bed, or maybe that means the kids haven't gotten up yet. Or, if you think about Toni Morrison, who always made work as a single mother, as a working single mother, getting up before the light. That was how she did that. So really understanding that in this chapter in my life, the writing is not in position 1, 2, 3, or 4 even. It's quite a bit further down. But I really do believe in chapters. And I really do believe I'm supposed to be doing this work. And at the end of the day, the book got written. As a writing experience, it was harrowing, because also, of course, I was writing about life, death, and our young people.
I imagine that the emotional toll must have been great, and you must have unearthed some things. The Trayvon Generation was originally published as an essay in The New Yorker. What compelled you to write the essay?
For so many of us who, in the expression like been Black all my life, right? The George Floyd moment, which some have called a reckoning, was certainly a consolidating moment. That's for sure. And the protests were at a scale where we understood that society was having a zeitgeist moment, where it was recognizing the horror of race-based violence. But to Black people, this was not new. This was serial. And so that was the first place that my mind was going, is like, okay, well, let's go back and call the other names. Let's understand this George Floyd moment, and going back to another sort of breakwater moment of Trayvon Martin, and turning to thoughts of the generation of young people, my own sons among them, and so many of the young people I have taught and mentored and loved, who have grown up with this constant and repeated exposure to Black death, to race-based violence on their phones, repeated. How do we listen to and think about the effect of this on our young folks? But also, the question that I always wanted to hold on to is, and where is the joy? What is the life force that cannot be extinguished? What are the communal coping mechanisms besides art and culture that we all have? And that's when I talk about vernacular dance, expressing ourselves in safe and joyful community, because that is what we have always managed to do. And with the challenge of what do we say to our young people? I think about Gwendolyn Brooks's line, "What do I tell my children who are Black, who are adjudged the least wise of the land?" What do we tell our children? Because what we want for them is for them to stand in their extraordinary power.
Sanford, Florida, where Trayvon Martin was hunted and murdered, is only about 16 miles, I believe, from Eatonville, the first all incorporated, which just means legally established Black town for our viewers. And that's where Zora grew up. And it was incorporated in 1887. We have Goldsboro, which was the Black town founded by the blood brother of the founder of Eatonville. And one of the questions that I had as I was reading the Trayvon Martin generation, is it just present or is it ancestral? And what does the distance in time and space tell us about the lives and the endurance of Black people.
That geographical situation is fascinating, and I had not known that. And so I am putting a moment of thought to that. To me, it gets to the importance of telling our history so that Black freedom and independence and innovation are never forgotten or papered over. Would that knowledge have changed what happened to Trayvon Martin? If it were more widespread knowledge, I don't know. Here's what I can tell you, though. The way that our independent spaces have been disrupted, de-resourced, have had highways cut through them, have been razed and burned, if you think about something like Tulsa, Oklahoma. When you think about what if that hadn't been done to deliberately destroy the sites of Black freedom, all of those interruptions that have interfered with Black wealth building, with Black autonomy, with Black governance, that has had a price. You think about another kind of economy in which a George Zimmerman would have somehow been pulled back a long time ago, identified for the violent, lawless bigot that he was at some other point before he started hunting that child. You hear resistance, some from the 911 operator, no, sir, you're not supposed to, no, sir. But what if he had been immediately tracked and someone had been sent to arrest him, to stop what was happening? A child is being hunted. We have someone there in 1 minute. I'm just thinking about a different order in which all of the channels that allow these terrible things to happen might have been set up a little bit differently.
When Zora was traveling around for the Federal Writers Project, she would learn folklore and
Yes.
dances and songs and even children's games. And there's recordings at the Library of Congress where she's saying, George so and so taught me this. And she's calling
Yes.
these names.
I love that you bring up those Library of Congress films. They are so fantastic. And when you see her in a ring of children, and then, the lady does the dances with them and does the hand claps and does the songs, they are absolutely extraordinary archival records of our communities. But also you see her spirit. You get a sense of who she really was in motion in the world and all of the things that nurtured and fed her genius. For her, the necessary solitariness of writing was fed by human beings, by Black people. I love those, and I could watch them all day.
I'm going to come back to a secondary question to that. That reminded me very much of Zora is the names that you call, not only of the people we have lost, but even in the artists. You're talking about the videographers who contribute. For me, Kendrick Lamar is all right. Of course, I know Kendrick Lamar, but I don't think about the director behind that. Can you talk to me about the importance of calling the names of these different artists, great, known, and unknown?
The calling of the names is so important because if things were made together, things were made together. There is in various Western white classical traditions a real fetishization of the individual artist. The idea that one person sort of stands upon a mountain, hands down these wonderful works, and they don't talk about Michelangelo's assistants or Leonardo's assistants, or that this too was communal work. I mean, you don't just go up on the roof of the Sistine Chapel all by yourself without any other human being helping you and paint a picture. So I think it's really important to talk about the hands that make the work in that essay. I wanted to look at their creative responses as well. What I think is interesting and what I wanted to highlight is that there are lineages. When you look at the filmmaker and artist Khalil Joseph, and you see what he's done in video space, very, very artful, and how that is tied to a visual arts tradition that he is a part of. I look to Donald Glover and Kendrick Lamar and the director Hiro Murai, who made some of those Flying Lotus videos and who is the main director on Donald Glover's Atlanta. People who were making art around that generation to say, this is how we are metabolizing all of this violence and sorrow and fear. To have a sense of, again, a generation of creators trying to say some important things together.
I'm always curious from our artist mothers what their children think about their writings. I am actually the mom of a little boy. He's only 5. So what did your boys think about the essay and then the adaptation into a book?
Kids can very nicely and politely not show interest. I have been so richly gratified that my boys that I raised, and also my boys, which is to say their friends, former students, my kids, they feel that the book spoke directly to them. And I could not ask for anything more, because I was speaking to them to say, we love you. We're offering you something. So in the expanded book, all of the art, all of the poetry, the Hurston, all of the Du Bois, this is what I think is enriching, and I'm listening to you.
And that's wonderful. I have to tell you, that was another similarity I found between you and Zora. This idea I've been playing with about Zora building bridges through the African diaspora. And I felt that you did that same thing with the intergenerational relationship. You didn't regard this younger generation as, oh, they don't know anything. You treated the generation with such reverence. And I can just really tell how passionate you are about your children, your students, and I have to applaud you for that. Now, I have to ask you, because I heard you mention Miss Toni Morrison, who is a titan in her own right
Oh,
and who
yes.
always will be. You mentioned a few Black visionaries, or quite a few, in the essay and the book. But I wonder, do you consider anybody to be your literary ancestor?
Well, so many people. I mean, that's not anything that I could answer with one person, but I could talk about a couple of the people. Gwendolyn Brooks and Lucille Clifton, for different reasons, have been incredibly important to me. With Gwendolyn Brooks, in poetry, I think she is the genius of the American 20th century. As a careful reader of her work, and I've written on her and put together an anthology of her work, I know it very, very deeply. It has just taught me so much about craft. It has taught me so much about voice, because she doesn't remotely sound like anybody else. Her syntax is invented. Her words, I mean, she is so singular. And so what it means to follow your own particular music, and what it is to be absolutely meticulous about form. And I don't just mean when she was writing sonnets, but throughout her life. That is what I learned from Brooks. And also, of course, to be of service to Black people, which is so much a part of her work. She lived it mostly in a 10-block radius her whole life, and she needed no more to make her art. All I had to do, she said, was look out the window, and there was my art. Lucille, I knew much better. She was a warm and wonderful and loving friend to me. I loved her very, very much and felt loved and seen by her. I will never forget, oh my goodness, giving a reading before I even had met her at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. And I looked out into the audience, and there was Lucille Clifton in the audience, having been driven from St. Mary's, Maryland, which was some hours away, to come to hear my reading. Even if I had never talked to her in my life, that single affirmation was so very extraordinary, and I felt lucky that we developed a beautiful friendship, and that I've also been able to be helpful with carrying on her legacy. I first read her poems when I was very, very young, and the apparent simplicity of them spoke to me. But then later, when I was a grown woman and thinking about much larger questions, I saw the profoundly meditative and understood in the distillation of her poem making that she was making sacred texts. So I would say that those two have been and will always be incredibly important to me.
Wow, I am tearing up imagining Lucille Clifton sitting in the audience
Oh,
listening to you. I don't know how you continue to read after that or before.
I had to take a moment.
So you talk about Lucille, and I found some intersections. Miss Lucille and Zora both attended Howard, and they're
Yes.
both widely celebrated for their use of dialect in their individual work. How might Miss Lucille and Zora's work be in conversation today?
That's a neat question. I think that Lucille was an artist of the city and Zora of the country. I mean, of course, Zora lived in DC, lived in New York, was a highly, highly citified woman. But when I think about the bulk of her work and the voices that she so richly captured, they were of Southern, smaller town Black folks. Lucille was not a creature of the big city, but she was a creature of cities and even more so of neighborhoods within cities. So Black community within Buffalo, Black community within Baltimore, Maryland, Black community within DC. Her first poems in her first book, Good Times, I think about her great poem, which I read 10,000 times when I was a kid in Washington, DC. She wrote, "Here in the inner city, or like we call it, home."
Mm,
And so I think that that would be the really interesting pairing of the two of them, is to think about the range of places that Black people make community that are represented and listened to with the ear of their work.
I love that. What do you think the usage of the vernacular, the dialect in each of their work teaches us about the use of language and how we use it?
Quite simply, that Black vernacular is among the most beautiful languages on earth. A question that it asks is, what is literature? What is literary? I mean, when you look at how in our vernacular we use figures of speech, we use metaphor, we use figurative language, we use, allusion, we use all of these so-called literary devices. We invent words, recurring phrases that are the finest poetry. So I just think it's really fascinating to think about that alongside other things in the Western canon, to say, well, what makes this great? And well, how come this is supposed to be above this? I don't see it. Measuring it by the same yardstick of, how do we understand language use to be compelling? Which, as English PhDs, we could talk about that all day long. And the Black vernacular is second to none.
I could talk to Dr. Alexander forever, but we're going to be respectful of her time. So I want to remind you to get her book, The Trayvon Generation. You can also read the essay to preface the reading of the book, and just follow her work, follow what she's doing. She is a genius of our time and for all generations. And I'm so honored to interview you on behalf of the Zora Neale Hurston Trust.
And I thank you for just a very beautiful and rich conversation. And I thank you for all that you brought to our time together.
Thank you.